Hey folks, welcome back. It's Halloween Day, so I thought I'd save my very favorite Lovecraftian horror RPG for Halloween Day itself, and that is Delta Green. As you can see from the green Delta symbol right here on the front of this beautiful slipcase. Now, I was a backer of the original Delta Green RPG Kickstarter campaign, which I believe was in 2015, I want to say, and they ended up delivering a heck of a lot more than was initially promised, and at no additional cost to the backers, which was great. So instead of just getting one big fat core rulebook, we got this slipcase set with two big fat rulebooks. Oop, we'll go this way. We've got the Agent's Handbook, which has basically all the rules you need for play as a character, and then the Handler's Guide, which has a lot more lore. As you can see, it's quite thick. You've got background stuff, you've got rituals, and you've got Mythos creatures, gods, all that kind of good stuff in here. So what I'm going to do is flip through these rather quickly, a little bit different approach than my usual, and explain more about the feel of the game as we go through rather than just focusing on specific rules and getting into the detail of things. That's because I want to explain why Delta Green I think is really great, but also might not be for everyone. And so in a follow-up video, I'm going to talk about, the main competing options for your Lovecraftian investigation type RPGs, which are this, Call of Cthulhu and Trail of Cthulhu, and talk about which one might be the best for your group and try and sort of summarize my views on that topic. But for now, we're just going to talk about Delta Green, and we'll start with the lovely Agent's Handbook. Now, we've talked about Delta Green to a certain extent in my last video, which was about the fall of Delta Green from Pelgrane. That was the Gumshoe system translation of this system. But this is the original article here. So Delta Green is set in the present day. And as you can see on the back here, so we have the same sort of background. Born of the U.S. government's 1928 raid on the degenerate coastal town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, the covert agency known as Delta Green opposes the forces of darkness with honor but without glory. Delta Green agents fight to save humanity from natural horrors, often at a shattering personal cost. So this is the player-only rulebook, and it points out it contains the rules for creating agents of all types, rules for tense fluid investigations, nerve-wracking rules for combat, mind-melting sanity rules, rules for home scenes where players see what their agents are fighting for, and that actually adds to the horror, in my opinion, in a really interesting way. Quick, intuitive rules to determine equipment and assets, and dossiers on the federal agencies most likely to be featured in play. Further terrors can be found in the book's companion volume, The Handler's Guide. For the full game, you really need both books, but as a player, this is the one you need. And you can see a rather terrified-looking, sweaty individual here, stuck in the woods, in the darkness. There's some unnerving kind of floating objects around him, and what looks to be a very thick and very aged tome or grimoire in his hands. So I'm not sure where things are going to go for him, but if it's Delta Green, it's usually not anywhere good. So with that, we'll take a quick flip through. You can see Delta Green's signature style here, which we saw also in the fall of Delta Green, where we've got, in the end papers even, this kind of overlapping sets of documents, a lot of them looking like official government pieces of documentation or bits of evidence and stuff like that. Some of them refer to quite disturbing things, like here we have recovered salts thought to be ground human remains, Song of Skin, photocopy papers translated from German, non-human head, unidentified, goat-like in appearance, wolf teeth. And there's stuff like that throughout the book to just create that creepy atmosphere. You'll see little snippets of conversations on these tablets, top secret labeled documents with security clearances and everything else. The artwork is all done by Dennis Detwiller, and the graphic designer is Simeon Cogswell, as you can see here. They've done a fantastic job with these books. They look and feel great. And that's the thing about Arc Dream, the publishers. They take a long time for stuff to come out, but when it comes out, it is worth the wait. I can promise you that much. So for the TOC, it follows pretty much what they say on the back. You start out with an overview of what is Delta Green, which we kind of know from the previous video, what makes an agent and character creation, the skills and the rules of the game in general, specific rules for combat, sanity loss, disorders and stuff like that, the home scenes, so this is what can happen as a consequence of being part of Delta Green, list of equipment and vehicles, and then their dossiers on all the different federal agencies, and then finally some appendices, which are really helpful actually because players who are experienced even with Lovecraftian games may not necessarily know what it's like to be a U.S. federal agent, particularly if you're not from the U.S. So the kind of glossaries and info on what skills and things to use for these different things you may need to do as part of Delta Green, including things like evidence tampering and disposing of a body to cover up the cosmic horror of what you've encountered. That's all really, really useful for newbies to this mythology, the Delta Green mythology. So in the overview, we get, I think, a really nice summary of what the game is really all about. And the reason why I say it's not necessarily for everyone is that you can't really win Delta Green. If you're playing Trail of Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu, you get these small victories where, you get to the end of a huge campaign and you stop the resurrection of Nyarlathotep or whatever, and you feel like you've done something major. You put off the apocalypse for another 100 years or whatever. But in Delta Green, there's very much this sense of The apocalypse is happening now. The bad things are coming. Inevitably, at some point, they will win. And basically, we're fighting to just get one more day at a time before these things take over. So they've got a beautiful summary of what the game is about. So consider this overview a warning. Delta Green is about fear. As it points out here, Delta Green is not about guns. Delta Green is not about a bug hunt. Delta Green is not about understanding. Delta Green is about the end of everything. Your family, everyone you know, your country, all life on Earth. It's about the end of everything and your place in it, because you'll end too. That's what the fear is about, and that's what the game is about. It's not about winning, and it's not about advancement, and it's not about the best weapon or the most clever plan. Delta Green is about the end of everything and how much of it you'll live to see. Welcome. I highly recommend that when you introduce this game to your players, if you want to try and do that, have them pick up this book and make sure that they read this overview section, because it summarizes beautifully what the game is about and what it's not about. The type of horror fundamentals that it uses. So investigation and uncertainty. There's a lot that the agents don't know at any given time. Suspense and horror. Violence and moral choices. Sanity and comprehension, of course, because of the cosmic horror aspects. Keeping secrets. So a lot of agents for Delta Green are actually keeping 2 secret lives and not just one, because they're also working in a government agency that doesn't know they're working for Delta Green. So the people that are in your life outside of work, you have to hide a lot of things from them. And that is demonstrated through your bonds as to how that creates some pretty serious consequences for your normal human life. And you get to watch that decay in real time as you play through the game. So again, not for everyone. And that's where the personal and professional consequences come in. So the impact of all these secrets can be devastating. You're part of a conspiracy, basically. And you can't blab about it to anyone, so you will often take out your frustrations on the people that you're closest to. And it's unfair, but it's natural. It's something that human beings will tend to do. And the game represents that explicitly through these home scene vignettes and how you interact with your bonds, which is what sets this game apart from Call of Cthulhu, even though the mechanics are really similar to Call of Cthulhu, as you'll see. But yeah, this overview section is great. It tells you a little bit about how to, properly respect the game and respect the handler, keep the mood going, try to trust that you're all there for the same reason, which is to have a enjoyable, suspenseful, and horrifying game of Delta Green. The Agent's Creation chapter. Now, it's going to be very familiar to people who are familiar with BRP and Call of Cthulhu. It goes back to more like 6th edition rules rather than 7th edition. So your statistics, or your attributes, as you might call them elsewhere, those are your core capabilities. So your things like strength, con, dex, int, all that sort of stuff. But here they're ranked from 3 to 18, and then you have a second column on the character sheet where you multiply them by 5 to make them a percentile, and then you will roll against those statistics when necessary. And that's the way things work, for example, in RuneQuest and in BRP in general. But in Call of Cthulhu 7th, they decided, well, we only ever do int times 5 or con times 5 or whatever. So we'll just make all the attributes also percentiles, but they haven't done that here. So you start out by making your core stats. You can roll them, or you can assign them from a few sample arrays that they have, depending how focused you want your character to be on certain things. What makes an agent basically is your stats, then your derived attributes that come from your stats. So things like your sanity, effectively your hit point, stuff like that. Your profession, which is what they do when they're not doing Delta Green ops, and that will affect what skill points and bonds you can have. So the more deep cover you are, say in the FBI, you'll tend to have less bonds, because it's just not practical to interact with a lot of normal people when you're a deep cover CIA agent, for example. Then you'll have your skills, which is what you gain from school, work, and life in general. And then you'll have the bonds, which are the people that are closest to you, that you go to, and that you fight to protect, ultimately. So they show you the steps of character creation in a little bit more detail, but I think looking at the character sheet is the most informative. You've got your stats and derived attributes have their section here, and as you can see, there's the base score, which again is from 3 to 18. Then you have your times 5 score, and depending on how high or low the stat is, it'll give you a sort of adjective to describe that character. So if the strength is really low, it might say they're feeble. If they're really high, they're beefy, stuff like that. There's a table for that. Right below that, you have your derived attributes, your hit points, willpower points, sanity, and your breaking point, which will change as you gain and lose sanity. Then you have your bonds over here. Your general character info is up at the top, things like your education, employment history, nationality, your name, age and DOB, all that kind of stuff. Put your bonds and their scores here, the strength of that bond. They're your motivations, and any mental disorder you might have go in this box. And then interestingly here you have your incidence of sand loss without going insane, which we saw also in the Fall of Delta Green. And that's represented here as well. So you can potentially adapt to violence and helplessness if you experience sand loss, but not a temporary insanity from sources that are related to violence or helplessness. But you can't adapt to the unnatural. You can never do that. And then the whole bottom of the sheet here is about your skills. You'll note here on the bottom that the way skills are increased in this game is the reverse of Call of Cthulhu. So in Call of Cthulhu, if you use the skill successfully, you tick the box. At the end of the session, you'll roll, try to fail the roll, and if you fail the skill roll, you will increase it by 1d10. Here, you tick a box when you fail. So failure is your opportunity to learn, which I like. That's a good life philosophy. There's only succeeding and learning, not success and failure. That's kind of the one positive message of Delta Green, perhaps. So then after the session, you'll add 1d4 to each check skills and then erase all the checks. You tend to not advance necessarily as quickly, but it encourages you to try the skills that you're not good at more, because if you fail, that's fine. They'll go up, and that encourages you to broaden your competencies beyond the skills that you have at a high level due to your professions and your training. So then it goes through detailed descriptions of the stats and how you derive your other stats, so your hit points, willpower, sanity, and your breaking point is important. So that's your sanity points minus your POW rating, just your POW raw rating between 3 and 18, not the ×5 one. You subtract that from your starting sanity, and then when you reach that point in sanity loss, you'll have a breaking point and you'll gain a disorder, and you'll note that in the disorders box. Those, of course, can be treated in different ways, but you could never really fully get rid of them in Delta Green. If you get psychoanalysis and you get, a disorder removed, they can come back and bite you later on the next time you hit a breaking point. So watch out for that. Then we got a list of some basic professions that you'll tend to see. So you need Delta Green agents or federal special agents, special force operators, but they also need things like academics, engineers, anthropologists, historians, computer scientists. And we have the general sort of list of careers here. So anthropology and historian, and it gives you the recommended stat you should focus on if you're going to be focusing your stats in any particular direction. Your professional skills, which you get just for choosing that pathway, and then you can choose from, in this case, 2 of these skills that you don't already have. And like Fall of Delta Green, we have more governmental special ops kind of language. So we have human as a skill, for example. And you can see as well, it tells you how many bonds you have. As an anthropologist, you're an academic, you're going to have lots of connections. So you have 4 bonds. Computer scientist, you're working more in front of a screen, in front of code. So you have 3 bonds, but you get some really useful skills in craft, electrician, mechanic, computer science, SIGINT, stuff like this. And then you can choose an additional 4 skills out of the list below. So computer scientists can be actually quite flexible. You can focus more on the engineering side if you want to, depending on what you choose down here. And then you have the generalized federal agents, so they can focus on con, pow, or cha, or charisma, and they have quite a lot of professional skills going on, and a choice of 1 of 5 additional skills, which include things like anything from computer science to heavy weapons to pharmacy. And they have 3 bonds, which is kind of an average amount, I would say. 4 is exceptional, and I think that's the highest you can start with. A lot of professions with specialization have 3, and a few skills that are highly specialized or very deep kind of special ops sort of positions, you get 2 bonds only. Then we have physicians, which are useful for things like medicine and first aid, and you can also choose, for example, forensic or psychotherapy, both of which can be useful for different reasons. You can be a generalized scientist, focusing on int, or a special operator, which is kind of the generic version of things like the Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, that kind of stuff. And they will have only 2 bonds because they're really focused on their training, and they don't have a lot of time in the regular world, but they do get a heck of a lot of professional skills in really useful stuff, especially related to combat. So along here, we also have some additional professions that can be useful for Delta Green. So alongside the federal agents and special operators and academics, you could also be a criminal, because some of the stuff you have to do for cover-up in Delta Green operations is useful from a criminal's point of view as well, like evidence tampering, corpse disposal, that sort of stuff. Grim as that may sound. You could also be a first responder, like a firefighter, so you'd be good with things like alertness, athletics, driving things, operating heavy machinery, or you could be a foreign service officer, so things like the State Department programs, U.S. aid, stuff like that. So that would give you a lot of experience in foreign environments, which can be helpful for Delta Green also. And it keeps on going. So they have also, you can be an intelligence analyst, which would be somebody from like NSA or CIA. So you're used to gathering information, collating information from different disparate sources, informants, and all this sort of stuff. You can be an intelligence case officer, which is basically developing foreign intelligence assets and utilizing them, keeping them productive, keeping them alive. You could be a lawyer or business executive. So you're used to moving around lots of money and or data or both. Or you might be something like a prosecutor or a DA, something like that. So you'd have skills in accounting and persuasion, law. You could be a media specialist, so you're more on the art, history, and persuade kind of end of things. And you could choose a lot of different specialisms there, including anthropology, archaeology, bureaucracy, foreign languages, all kinds of stuff, including occult to 50%, which is really useful to have. You could be a nurse or paramedic, again, focus on the medical side of things. You could be a pilot or sailor, so that means you could choose the pilot skill for one or more different types of, air, land, or sea craft. You could be a police officer, which would give you experience in bureaucracy, criminology, and firearms, and human, persuasion, and search. Lots of useful stuff. You could be a program manager, somebody who runs an organization, wherever they may be. So that will, again, give you knowledge in accounting, bureaucracy, the law, persuasion, different kinds of stuff like that. So already there's many different options for your characters. Then we have the soldier or marine. So these are the infantrymen, the guys on the ground who we see in this little picture here in front of some creepy statue. They're, of course, going to focus on strength and con and have lots of skills in driving, firearms, military science, navigation, artillery, demolitions, all that kind of cool stuff. And they have lots of bonds as well because of being used to being part of a well-functioning military unit means you have to work well as a team. You can also make your own professions, and they give you a very quick guide to how to do that. It's really easy. Pick 10 professional skills, divide 400 skill points between them, and add those points to each skill starting level. As a rule of thumb, professional skills should be 30 to 55%. None of them may be higher than 60%. You start with 3 bonds, but you can then customize. So if you add an additional bond, then you only have 350 skill points for your professional skills. For each bond removed, down to a minimum of 1 bond, you would add 50 more skill points. So that's how the bonds and skill points kind of balance out. Then they have some optional bonus skill point packages. So like in Call of Cthulhu, you get skill points to spend on general interests stuff after you get your professional skills. But these packages make it easier to kind of generate a history for your character that makes sense, where maybe, before they ran an organization, they got an MBA. So that gives them skill points they can spend in accounting, bureaucracy, human, law, persuade, and any 3 others of personal specialties, for example. So it's a quicker way to get a character history that kind of works well with the main current profession that you've chosen. But you don't have to do that. It's just an optional thing to do that. Then they give you detailed descriptions of the skills. So as with Call of Cthulhu, up to about 29% in the Delta Green world, you're kind of a dedicated hobbyist. 30 to 39% would be like a college minor, basic training. 40 to 59 would be a college major or years of experience. And at 50% in a foreign language, you have native fluency, by the way. So it may not seem like 50% is a lot, but actually that means you're fluent if it's a language skill. So think of 50% as being quite high. At 60 to 79%, you've got decades of experience or graduate or doctoral degree. At anything above 80, you're looking at a lifetime's pursuit or multiple doctorates. So when your skills are that high, you've really spent a lot of time focusing. And they also have handy tables for all your skills and what their base ratings will be. You'll notice that the really specialized ones start at 0, because if you haven't studied a foreign language at all, you're not going to have any hope of understanding it. If you haven't studied forensics or heavy weapons at all, you won't have any help with doing those. So it's all quite sensible, but things like unarmed combat, melee weapons, alertness, accounting, most people have some basic knowledge of stuff like that. So you will have a base level of that without needing to spend any points. And then the big difference from regular Call of Cthulhu comes in 2 parts when it comes to skills. So firstly, you'll notice in a lot of Delta Green adventures that quite a lot of skill rolls can be avoided by just having somebody with a skill level high enough. So it might say something like, if anybody has search 40 plus, give them this clue. Or if they have persuade 50 plus, then the NPC will give them this. And so that kind of circumvents the, I would say, perceived problem in Call of Cthulhu where important clues are gated behind skill rolls. But in modern Call of Cthulhu adventures, that really doesn't happen really ever anymore. And that led to the design of the gumshoe system as well, where you get clues automatically as long as you have the right skill. But Delta Green's gone about it slightly differently, but the result is basically the same. If the skill is there and you have a decent level of competency, you just get it, or you'll have a really good chance of rolling for it. And then the other side, of course, we have the improving skills, which I already noted. So you improve your skills on a failure in this system, which encourages you to use those skills that are no good. Try and get them built up a little bit. It notes there's no library use skill, because we're not in 1920s anymore, right? We're in the modern era. So instead, you'll be specializing and researching on particular topics, right? So instead of using a generic research or library use skill, you'll use the skill appropriate to the sort of genre of information you need, like history, science, medicine, etc. Some research that's very basic, like just looking through news articles, over a period of time, you would just use an int roll, spend a certain amount of time, or something like that. You can also get special training. This allows you to have a particular dedicated knowledge of a kind of subgenre of a skill. So you might have special training in things like scuba, under swim, lockpicks as an extra dex skill. And of course, there's space on the character sheet to put in additional skills and special training. There are ways you can do that either at character creation or during downtime as well, which is nice. Then, of course, we have our detailed descriptions of all the skills along with their base rating, but we pretty much know all of these. They're very similar to what you found in the Fall of Delta Green, but they work like Call of Cthulhu skills. You're rolling on a D100. Then we get to bonds, which is the real departure from Call of Cthulhu. So your bonds are completely determined by you and how you feel your character is and, who's important to them. So they give examples. They could be your spouse or ex-spouse, your son or daughter, or it could be a group like your siblings or survivors of some shared trauma, like support group, really anything. You pick a number of bonds, either an individual or a small group, equal to your bond score, and then you can use that bond basically deflect sanity loss that you've had during the course of the game. And then at the end of the op, you will then play out a home scene where you speak to your bond and you'll have to work out how did you lash out at them or damage that relationship, because the bond will take damage instead of your psyche. And that shows how you're deflecting the horror of your work onto those around you and eventually alienating those around you. And what is interesting as well is just to ramp up the crappiness of feeling a bond disappear. When a bond deteriorates to 0, then that is gone. You can build it up again if you try again from scratch, basically trying to rebuild a relationship from nothing, but you cross it off the sheet and you leave it there. That's the key. So they want you to remember that you screwed up that relationship. That's the kind of game Delta Green is. And also there's a note here that you can form bonds with your fellow agents. And that happens when, for example, if a member of the team suffers a temporary insanity, somebody gets a disorder, somebody dies or is incapacitated, that kind of severe stress will bring the team together and it can create bonds between Delta Green teammates. Their starting value is half of your agent's charisma, whereas the bonds you get at the start of character creation have a score equal to your agent's charisma. That, again, is the raw value, not the times 5 value. So it's interesting as well that, your bonds will continually change up during play. And quite often, things that you will do on downtime that are not related to your home life will damage your personal bonds, but not your Delta Green bonds. So they do behave differently in that way. If you want to as well, if your character is, in your view, somebody who's experienced with the unnatural in some way, there are 4 different ways that you can express that. So they could have been exposed to extreme violence, which gives them some occult skill, reduces the SAN, reduces 3 from their charisma and every bond, and they're adapted to violence. They could have been held captive or imprisoned by something unnatural, so they again get 10 to occult, reduce SAN by 5, and then subtract 3 from your agent's POW, and you're adapted to helplessness. Hard experience give you plus 10 occult and plus 10 to any other 5 skills besides unnatural, but you can't go above 90%, and then you reduce your sanity by 5 and remove 1 bond completely. And finally, you have things man was not meant to know, so you gain 10% in unnatural, add 20% to occult, reduce your SAN by your POW number, and you get a new disorder already at the beginning of the game. Then you reset your breaking point to your new sanity value, which again will be your sanity minus your raw POW value. And here we have a completed character sheet. So throughout all this, they give you a nice example of this character being built up. His name is Yusuf Masim. Our agent Daryl is his Delta Green code name, and everything's all filled out here. Just like in Call of Cthulhu, the base values for skills are noted in parentheses next to them, so if you don't have points added to them, you can just leave those boxes empty. You can see he chose to be a computer scientist from the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and so he's got skills for that, and he took the hard experience option for his damaged veteran option as a current member of Delta Green. If you haven't been inducted into Delta Green yet, and the adventure is designed to do that, then I wouldn't use any of those packages, obviously. But yeah, the character design process is really simple, gives you lots of freedom, tons of freedom, in fact, and they explained really, really well. Now, the other difference here is, as I've mentioned, there are lots of ways to resolve a test without dice. So you can think about, the level of skill that the particular task would require. And if your agent has that level of training, just give them the clue. Don't mess around with rolls. If you're resolving a test with dice, that would be because it's difficult, the situation is unpredictable, or there's some kind of consequence. So again, similar to the Fall of Delta Green and the way you use general abilities and stuff in that game. If you don't have the skill, if you have a 0, then you can't make any attempt at all to use it. It's too specialized for that. But what's interesting is how the success works. So as you remember, in Call of Cthulhu, you have your regular success, then you have hard success, which is when you're below half of your skill value, and your extreme success, which is when you're below 1/5 of your skill value. And then you can have a fumble, which is 96 to 100 if your skill value is below 50, and just 100 if you're above 50. Here, it works differently. So a critical success is a roll of 1 or any success where the 2 dice match. So, for example, if your skill is 50%, you achieve a critical success if you roll a 1, 11, 22, 33, or 44. So that would be a critical success. And they mention here it should be considered twice as good as an ordinary success, and the handler should help you work out what that means in a given context. In combat, it's obviously double damage. It's easy enough. But for everything else, you'll need to work out what extra benefits the character will get from a critical success. A success is just when you roll equal to or less than the test chance, but you haven't got the matching numbers. A failure is a roll that's higher than the test chance, and again, the numbers don't match. A fumble is when you roll 100 or any failure where the dice match. So again, if your agent is at 50% and you roll a 55, 66, 77, 88, 99, or 100, those are fumbles. And they can be of varying degrees of badness, but they should be bad. They get in the way of what you're trying to do actively, not just a simple failure. So they give some examples here, like maybe you could lose some HP or temporarily lose 1d4 strength counter dex. If it's an emotional thing, perhaps you lose some willpower points, or you get alienated, so you offend an important NPC, or stuff like that. There are lots of different ways you can approach it, but as always, the game is filled with examples, which are really helpful. The luck roll also works differently, so any luck roll in Delta Green is just a coin flip. There's a 50% chance that it goes the handler's way, and a 50% chance it goes the agent's way. So if you want to ask whether you've managed to remember to bring along your flashlight or whatever, the handler can ask for a luck roll a D100. There's 50% chance that you did remember, 50% chance you didn't. And if you get a critical success or failure on that roll, then that will affect your luck accordingly as well. So that's kind of interesting. Then we go through opposed tests, which are actually quite difficult in this game because a critical success will beat a success. But what's interesting is that if you both roll a success, then whoever has the higher roll wins. So what you want to do really is either get a critical or you want to roll a success that is as close to your skill value as possible. The lower it is below your skill value, the worse off you are, effectively. So that's kind of a backwards approach from what you would expect in Call of Cthulhu. So again, really important to look through this stuff in detail if you're coming from Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, because the dice rolls work pretty differently. The way that you have these 4 levels of success, but they're determined differently, and that is reflected also in the luck rolls and in the opposed tests as well. Then we've got rules for pursuit and the use of willpower. So willpower represents your mental fuel. If you have low willpower, then you'll have an emotional breakdown and you lose 20% on all of your skills rolls until your willpower rises above 2 again. If you run out, you get to 0, then you lash out completely. You might collapse in sobs or just become violent or randomly or just pass out. The handler basically gets control of your agent until your willpower returns to a non-zero value. And you can't succeed at any test, including sanity. Eventually, you'll fall asleep just randomly because you're just too freaked out to continue being conscious, basically. To regain willpower points, you need to get a full night's sleep, and you'll then regain 1d6 willpower. If you play up one of your agent's personal motivations in a way that the handler thinks is really good, then you can gain 1 willpower that way during play as well. Then they have a whole thing here about exhaustion, so that's what happens when you run out of your willpower. You can stave off the effects by stimulants, which could be chain smoking or various drugs. Harder drugs like methamphetamine will offset the exhaustion penalty for longer than chain smoking, which is 1d6 hours, and 2d6 for harder drugs. And you can't physically sleep during that time, and you won't restore any willpower, but it'll allow you to keep pushing. But at some point, you'll run out of the ability to remain sleepless. It ends up being bad for you. You end up being exhausted. That'll be a bad thing. You can also have sleeplessness, which you can combat with drinking heavily or sleeping pills, which gives you a plus 20% bonus to the SAN test to get to sleep. You know, basically the first time you try to get to sleep after suffering temporary insanity or gaining a disorder, you have to make a SAN test or you can't sleep. And so sedatives and booze can help you with that. So it's quite realistic, but again, pretty grim. Then we get into combat. So there's quite a lot you could do combat-wise in this game, but it is, again, quite similar to Call of Cthulhu. You go in dex order, as in Call of Cthulhu. You go from highest to lowest. So if there's a tie, either you go simultaneously or you can work out some kind of tiebreaker, but they leave that up to the handler. And you can only do 1 action on your turn. It's a really short amount of time. So you can spend a turn, for example, aiming to get a plus 20% on your shot in the next turn, assuming you aren't hit in the meantime. You can attack, either with your melee weapons, unarmed combat for punching and kicking, firearms for a gun, or athletics for a thrown weapon. You could do called shots, which come with penalties, so be aware of that, but you might want to try and take out somebody's arm so they can't use their weapon or whatever, so there is an option to do that. If you're using unarmed combat and both your hands are free, you can try to disarm somebody if you're close enough. If somebody's trying to disarm, pin, or attack you up close, you can do a dodge. You can try to escape being pinned. You can fight back if you're in melee combat. You can move up to 10 meters jogging, 20 meters running, or 30 meters sprinting, but you may need to make a dex times 5 roll to keep your footing if it's like rough terrain or you're under pressure. If there's cover at the end of the agent's movement, you can duck behind it and get protection from that, which is cool. You can also pin people down to immobilize a target, either up against something or against the wall. That makes them easier to hit. You get a plus 20% bonus to any to hit rolls for that, and any related skills. You can also choose to wait, so when your slot comes up, you can say, no, I want to see what happens with this or this first, and then jump in a later time. You can't jump in before you normally would, but you can jump in anytime after you would come in the dex order. Or you can do other stuff, drink a potion of mysterious liquid, start a program on a computer, reload your gun, whatever. And then they tell you how attack rolls work, which is basically like any other roll, but you do have some combat modifiers, which they lay down nicely in this table here. Negative penalties have no limit. You could go all the way to like minus 100 potentially if things are really badly against you, but positive modifiers max out at plus 40. So again, keep that in mind. You can also do optionally other kind of called shots if you want to try and stun somebody rather than kill them. Do a flesh wound just to freak them out, or a headshot to get a critical regardless of whether dice match or not. I think that's a really cool rule. You can also do some normal damage and have an additional effect like stun or disarm, knock the target prone, make the hit a called shot if it's a critical, or allow the attacker to immediately roll a second attack. So there are other ways to do called shots, critical hits, and I really like those options. But again, discuss with your handler, see what they want to do and what the group thinks is best. Then there's surprise attack, shooting into a crowd, dodging and fighting back, damage bonuses from your strength score summarized in a handy table here. And then there's some permanent injury examples here. So permanent injuries happen when you reduce 2 or fewer HP and make a con times 5 test and fail. Then you get a permanent injury. You select the stat to be permanently reduced by the lowest 10-sided die of the failed roll to a minimum score of 3. If strength or con drop, then you adjust your HP as well. Stun attacks, you have to basically make a con times 5 test to recover and act normally. Otherwise, you're still stunned. You can do that each turn. And if you get to 0 HP, you die. That's it. But you can be resuscitated if you get to the downed character within a number of minutes equal to their con score. And if you succeed with the first aid test, you'll give them 1d4 HP, which is doubled if it's critical, and they can go back to life, basically. If it fails, then they die, and that's it. If a wounded character is stabilized, then they can also be given first aid for 1d4 points, but it's only once per injury. Treatment is something that happens later, as is recuperation. You need to get people to a hospital, and they can go and try and recover, but you can have complications. If you try and do anything physical or stressful while you're still recovering, you will get HP damage as you rip sutures, or fever sets in as you get infected or something like that. And then we have a handy table of damage for typical melee weapons, small arms, automatic and heavy weapons, and selective fire, and note the lethality percentage here. Lethality is, of course, one of the great innovations of this game. I love it so much for a modern era game. And we saw how it was adapted to Gumshoe, and the way it works here is quite similar, except it's more D100 based, basically, as is everything else. So if you hit with a weapon that has a lethality rating, then instead of rolling your normal damage, you roll percentage dice against the weapon's lethality, and if that succeeds, then a human target immediately drops to 0 HP. If it fails, though, you still get a benefit. So you add the 2 dice together as if they were individual D10s, and they take that much additional HP damage. So they might die anyway, even if you fail the lethality roll. And some weapons have a kill radius, so they inflict a lethality roll on each character in that radius. And you can see that here with like a light machine gun or heavy machine gun. Anybody within 3 meters of the target could potentially be killed by a blast of automatic fire, which is pretty awesome. Grenades have a kill radius of 10 meters. Rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, have a 30% lethality and a 10-meter kill radius. So it's just a really clever way to get around having to roll a million different dice for a million different bullets flying out of your guns. Modern guns are really lethal. They can shoot really fast. So they just shortcut it by giving the lethality rating. And there's lots of cool other ideas that relate to that. So an attack that has a kill radius terrifies the enemy and your own agents. So even if they miss, you're sort of struck by terror and you throw yourself to the ground or try and find cover. If you want to stifle that and act normally, then you need to pay 1 sanity to do so, because your automatic human fear instinct kicks in and you try to avoid death, and you'll miss your next turn because you'll have to stand up from being prone or whatever. But to escape that, you're going to pay a sanity cost. And there's loads of great rules for suppression, selective fire, so different ways of doing, a single shot, short burst, a long burst, a short spray, or a long spray, and they all have different effects. There's rules for blowing things up. And then protection in combat, which comes from armor. That reduces incoming damage by the number indicated. So as you can see, a heavy tank is 25, so good luck with that. And then, certain kinds of creatures, like huge ones, basically they take the lethality rating of a weapon as HP damage, but they aren't affected as a normal human target would be. Lethality only applies to human type targets, basically. But you will encounter a lot of cultists in this game, so it's a very useful rule to have nonetheless. And then you have transcendent entities as well that just are kind of phased out of reality. They can't be harmed by normal forces or normal matter. And of course we have poisons and diseases. Poisons have a lethality rating, and diseases will kind of inflict damage over time, and both of them will have different symptoms, and some diseases have a cure. Ebola doesn't, for example, so that's really bad. And with the disease, you need to make a con check, and you'll suffer half damage and recover if you succeed. But some diseases that are really bad have a penalty. So when you make your con check, you'll have to do it at -40 with Ebola, so that's bad. With the poisons, they have a speed at which they operate, and then you'll need to make a lethality check. You might just die from being bitten by a spider or being surrounded in sarin gas or ricin. Then we have other sources of damage, your usual stuff, falling, impact, suffocation, fire, which again, lethality is applied for major sources of fire as well. Then we got sanity. So again, like Fall of Delta Green, there are 3 different ways to suffer sanity loss. So you have suffering violence or inflicting violence, helplessness, and then finally the unnatural, and they give examples for each of those in increasing severity. And then we have the disorders. So when you suffer temporary insanity in this game, which is similar to Call of Cthulhu, when you suffer, more than a certain amount of sand damage in one go, you can, after losing 5 or more sanity in a single roll, you lose self-control and you either flee, struggle, or submit. You work with the handler to determine which stance your agent takes. Different circumstances will make one or more of those options more sensible than the others. Now we have details of the disorders. You can develop phobias, manias. Some disorders are basically chronic and ongoing, and you'll just be fairly normal, but stress can cause an acute episode, and when an acute episode begins, you can try to repress it by projecting the stress and trauma onto a bond, the same way you would with insanity. Then there's effects of disorders, and then here's some sample disorders from violence, which can include things like addiction, depression, intermittent explosive disorder, which is like uncontrollable rage, PTSD, sleep disorders. From helplessness, you can get addiction, anxiety, dissociative identity, so you might actually start to fragment into multiple personalities over time. You can have claustrophobia or agoraphobia, depending. From the unnatural, you will get very often amnesia, depersonalization, depression, fugues, where you just kind of wander off in a fog and don't remember anything. Megalomania, where you think that you've seen these crazy things because you are looking to the face of God, you're a messiah of some kind. And there's permanent insanity, of course, where they can manifest either via complete catatonia, delusions, and ranting, or psychopathy, but in any case, you're no longer a player character at that point. Then we have resisting insanity and projecting it onto a bond. So the way you do that, as I mentioned before, basically that's when you're deflecting the horrors of your work onto those close to you. So you could spend willpower to reduce the sanity loss. You roll your 1d4, reduce your willpower by that much, and then you reduce the sand loss by the amount of willpower that you spent, which is the amount that you rolled, to a minimum of 0, and then you reduce the bond score by the same amount. So then the next time you interact with that bond, you have to decide what that projection looks like. Do you get irrationally angry at them? Do you detach from them and miss an important engagement or forget an anniversary or something? There's different ways to do it, but you basically have to watch your personal life crumble. But it can save you at a key moment. Projecting onto a bond when you're near a breaking point is kind of a must, really, if you've got any willpower left. But, willpower is another resource to manage that you don't have in Call of Cthulhu. So, again, Delta Green is a bit harsher on the characters than a lot of other games, even in the horror genre. So, recovering sanity, you can do that through therapy or through your bonds. You get some sanity back for destroying the unnatural, but it's only the minimum sand loss for that particular threat. So, if the sand loss was 1 on a success or 1d6 on a failure, for example, then destroying that creature will just get you the 1 sanity back because that's the minimum. But still, any sanity point is better than none. Then we have some stuff about the home scenes. So between missions, you'll have stuff to do. Maybe fulfill your responsibilities. So you'll go on with your normal job at work and you'll do stuff at home. You'll roll a sand test, and if you succeed, you improve the bond by 1d6. A critical success also adds 1 sand. Failure will add 1 to the bond, and a fumble means some disastrous conflict reduces the bond by 1d4 and your sand by 1. So try not to fumble those. We go back to nature, which is helpful for your sanity, but it reduces 1 bond other than a bond for Delta Green by 1 as you let your responsibilities lapse. You can establish a new bond, but in doing so, you'll neglect one of your other bonds and reduce it by 1. You can go to therapy, which will help you cope with sand loss and with disorders. I won't go into all the details here because there's a lot that can happen, and you have to decide as well whether you're going to tell the therapist the truth, and they have to decide then whether they believe it or not. You can also work on improving your skills and stats. So basically, you can study or train extensively to try and boost any 2 separate skills or stats, or 1 stat and 1 skill. So that might be taking night classes, lifting weights, meditating, and whatever that particular skill or stat seems to make sense for it. And you'll attempt a test of the stat times 5 or a test of the skill. And if you fail, you add 3d6 to the skill or 1 point to the stat to a maximum of 18. That's pretty cool. Along with failure leading to improvement of your skills, you can also choose actively to try to improve a skill or a stat in your downtime. But again, it will let one of your bonds lapse by 1. You can follow up on your personal motivations, and then you take a sand test. A success will give you 1 sand or 1d4 for a critical, and reduce 1 one bond by one. A fumble will cost you 1 sand. You can practice to get special training, which reduces a bond by 1, but you'll get special training, which could be really useful for certain missions. Or you can stay on the case, so you can't forget what happened in your operation. You're going over the old evidence, you're going over old case files, you just keep working on stuff. And the handler will secretly roll criminology or occult. If you get a success, then they'll give you some pertinent clue that they've devised. And if it's a critical, you'll get a particularly valuable one. If it's a failure, you'll find nothing. If it's a fumble, they'll give you an actively wrong clue. Either way, you'll gain 1d6 minus 3 sand in coming to terms with what happened. But if that actually turns out to be a loss of sand, because there's a minus 3 there, then you'll be sort of obsessing in a self-destructive way. Finally, you can also study the unnatural, so you can spend a vignette at home looking at a forbidden tome, looking at shocking data from prior cases, or some other source of unnatural knowledge. That'll raise your natural skill, and then you must choose one bond which loses 1d4 points. You can also get blowback. So you have to leave your job sometimes with little notice, or come up with some flimsy reason to not attend your job or do things for your home obligations. So you can sometimes get fired from your job. If you push your luck a bit too often, maybe you need to do a charisma test, or you might need persuade or bureaucracy if you get a suspension or something like that. Getting fired costs you up to 1 sanity from helplessness. You need to make a charisma test or lose 1d4 points from each bond that's not Delta Green. The test is at minus 20% if the bond is a colleague from the job as well. But you're still in Delta Green. They won't fire you. You're still valuable to them. But if you're prosecuted, that's something different. And sometimes that could happen because maybe you didn't cover up things correctly, or you misappropriated your privileges as a federal agent to help Delta Green, and you get found out. That could result in severe sanctions, including potentially prosecution for federal crimes, maybe even probation or catastrophic fines, or ending up in prison. So yeah, not great. Then we've got our lists of tools and vehicles. Like Call of Cthulhu, they try to avoid accounting for things dollar for dollar because that's not very much fun. It takes a lot of time. So they categorize things by expense categories, from incidental, which agents themselves can take care of, then substantial, then unusual, then major, and extreme. So agents can typically handle incidental or standard expenses themselves if need be. Unusual expenses or major expenses, you'd need help either from Delta Green or from your host agency for your real job, and you'd have to come up with some way to justify that. Extreme expenses are very unlikely to get. You'd need access to black budgets with no oversight, like maybe certain CIA positions, or you'd need to be astonishingly wealthy to get that kind of thing. And then they have great lists of operational gear and how to do requisition. So if you're trying to officially get gear, you'll need to do a bureaucracy roll, and it gives you a summary of how that works for the different categories of expense. The more expense, the more you have to deal with negative modifiers, possible time delays, potential review process that could catch you out, and worse repercussions for wrongful use. So if you get an extreme expense, it gets reviewed, and you are found wrongful, you could be prosecuted or fired. So look out for that. But I love that all these details of being a federal agent are kind of laid out for you here. It's really cool. It makes sure that after an op, you think about avoiding scrutiny, covering the trail, tampering with evidence, whatever you need to do to make sure that you don't get screwed by, what you're doing is essentially trying to save the world for a bit more time, but your bosses might not care about that. They care about their budget, they care about their programs, and they don't know that you're working for Delta Green, and they can't know. Now, program managers have some advantages in this kind of thing. They can use the accounting skill instead, and there's a different table for them to look at. You can also use illicit cash to try and get certain things, or if you want restricted items like certain explosives, encryption devices, or, certain types of guns or military grade materials, you can turn to the black market, and the prices will be even higher, but it may be a way to do it. You can also craft things yourself if you have the appropriate skill, but it'll take a while and could potentially take quite a while if you're building something with a lot of complexity. Then we got our list of loads of cool weapons, everything from knives and stun grenades to tasers, firearms of many different types, pistols, shotguns, submachine guns, rifles, and carbines, heavy weapons, demolitions, and artillery. And we got our body armor. You can also use armor-piercing or hollow point bullets with their different effects, which we saw as well in Fall of Delta Green. And then there are lots of other types of equipment, which are laid out in these lovely tables here. So we've got more detail, everything you could possibly need here for a typical agent, all the different types of firearms, whether they're restricted or not, the skill required to use them, their range, the expense level, all that kind of stuff, and the damage or lethality if relevant. And we've got heavy weapons, demolitions, artillery, body armor, ground vehicles, including everything up to tanks, water vehicles, air vehicles, other gear and services like transportation, lodging, coming up with cover identities like fake passports and things, storage, research costs, communications and computers equipment, surveillance, lighting and vision equipment, B&E stuff, lockpicks, forcible lockpick guns, emergency and survival gear, off the books medical care, weapon accessories like optical gun sights, sound suppressors, night vision sights, law enforcement equipment, intelligence equipment. This is stuff that's only available through official requisition. There's no way you can get it other than that. And then we have our various dossiers on the federal agencies. And I'm going to leave these as an exercise to the reader because they will be sort of more up to date. They will not be precisely the same as you saw in The Fall of Delta Green, if you do have that game. But there are loads more professions outlined for every federal agency that they outlined, which is great. So if you decide you want to work for the DEA, I don't know why you'd want to do that, but never mind. Within that, you have several new professions that you can look in. So in effect, there are dozens of professions in the game besides the ones laid out in the character creation chapter, and depending on which part of the government you choose to be in, if you want to go that route, there are lots of options for you then to take on top of those with specific attributes. So that's a very cool aspect of the game as well. We go also into the DoD service branches. So this is where you have the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marines, and there's multiple careers within the Army. I mean, you can see all this stuff all the way up to SOCOM, Special Ops. Same with the Air Force, from, basic operatives, rescue squadrons, all the way up to cyberspace operations and special fighter squadrons. In the Navy, you have, again, they have their own criminal investigative service. You could be in the hospital corps, you can be in explosive ordnance disposal, or you can be in SOCOM. And then you have the Marine Corps, who are pretty much hardcore anyway. And you could be a member of their Special Purpose Force or the Marine Corps Security Force Regiment. They get tons and tons of useful skills, as you can see. But the Special Forces, as I said, they often just have 2 bonds, so be aware of that. And this poor guy, Cthulhu Waits Dreaming, he's trying to tell us, but nobody will listen. And then we have Special Operations Command, which is SOCOM, which is referred to in a few different places already, as we've seen. And within that, you have these kind of specialized subdivisions, the Army 75th Ranger Regiment and stuff like that. So, it's just such a huge number of ways to get involved with these different agencies, and it's lots of fun. I think for the characters, especially if you're new to the world of government and intelligence, it's quite educational, really. There's an educational value to this game, which you can't say about a lot of games. Then we have a general chapter about intelligence and diplomacy, so things like security clearances, the main intelligence agencies, which of course people know about, the CIA and stuff like that, but there are others as well. The NSA, the NGA, National Reconnaissance Office, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the National Counterterrorism Center, Defense Intelligence Agency. The U.S. intelligence apparatus is enormous. And then we go through each of these in detail and what it's like to be part of them, what their history is like, and then some new professions as well. So it's for the CIA here. We've got the Department of State and their operatives, their authority, field operations, suggested professions. Then we got public safety. So this is things like emergency responses. You can be part of the CDC. So maybe you're used to dealing with rapid response for infectious diseases, which of course we've seen a lot in recent years. And there are numerous possible careers within the CDC as well. You could even be part of the EPA. So you can have more bonds from these careers because you don't need to be secretive about being in the EPA. But they do actually have criminal enforcement divisions, of course, because some people break the law in the environment. They dump horrible things into the water or whatever. So you go out and you arrest those people. They also have office specialists for monitoring and using sensor equipment, sending engineers to trouble sites and stuff like that. And then finally, we have our appendices on tradecraft, which again are really educational for the new Delta Green operative. How to go unnoticed, how to conduct surveillance. And it gives you tables for all the different things you might need to do. Evidence tampering, disposing of a body, which includes of stuff like, carving up a corpse for dispersed burials, dissolve the body in acid, really gross stuff. But sometimes things will get so bad that you'll need to do stuff like that to cover up what you've done. How do you do an interrogation? Does torture work or truth drugs? Searching and arresting people, breaking and entering, running human assets, evidence tampering, how to use comms safely for operational security, using safe houses and green boxes. So green boxes are like a specialized storage locker where weapons and artifacts can be stashed that the team doesn't want them to be destroyed. But basically, you have to make sure that they're held somewhere securely. Then we have an extensive glossary for equipment, individuals, info and disinfo, locations, miscellaneous stuff, operations, organizations, and procedures. Recommended media if you want some inspiration. And that is the player's guide in a nutshell. It's really fantastic. It gives you more than enough information to jump into the game. And by the time you've read this, I guarantee you'll be a hell of a lot more both educated and nervous about the U.S. intelligence apparatus. So now we'll take a quick look at the Handler's Guide. I say quick, but you know how these things go. The Handler's Guide, of course, will give us a lot more of the background detail, which is always handy when you're dealing with an extensive set of historical background and mythos background like you are in Delta Green. But again, we'll go through pretty quickly because nobody wants me reading lore at them for an hour and a half. It's a much thicker book, as you can tell, than the Investigator's Guide. and that's because there's a lot of background to go through. But I'll give you sort of a basic rundown. So there's more here about the world of Delta Green, and we have a huge detailed discussion of the past. So starting on page 14, all the way up to page 140, basically, that's the history of Delta Green. So a lot of the book is just the lore, which is great. It's fantastic reading, not great YouTube viewing, so we'll skip through most of that. Then there's loads of info about the unnatural, including known unnatural entities, relevant stats, great old ones, tips on creating your own unnatural threats, the schism in the program. The program is how people refer to Delta Green when they're out and about and they don't want people to know what they're talking about. And then the opera. So agents often refer to a mission as a night at the opera, and there's a book called that, which has some great intro operations in it, by the way. Then there is a sample operation, Operation Fulminate, which is actually pretty disturbing. So it does a good job of setting you up for what Delta Green is really like. But just be warned, there should be perhaps a content warning on that. Again, we have some lovely atmosphere setting and terrifying visuals from Dennis Detweiler. And really, this game does a great job of helping you get what you need to know to run Delta Green as a handler. So you start off with, what is Delta Green doing? Who are the outlaws and what are they about? What is the program? What is the unnatural? How should I be a handler? How can I teach new players? How do I set the mood? Introducing new players to the game. I really love this illustration, by the way. That's one of my all-time favorites right here. It's an insect from Shagai burrowing into somebody's skull. Never a good thing. Yeah, if you want to establish the inciting event for a player joining Delta Green, then, some tips on how that might go. There's a nice example of play as well, just on a basic level, showing how you interpret rules in the moment. Then we get this extensive coverage of the genesis of Delta Green, the development of the Black Chamber, which was a nickname of a joint War Department and State Department SIGINT group and cryptography unit operating during World War I. It's linking a fake history to real history again in a reasonably successful way. Real history is preserved, but there's this extra layer of kind of secret war against the unnatural. And again, there's loads of interesting info within here as atmospheric things. So, for example, how to portray the deep ones, to make sure they're alien, make sure they're creepy, that hybrids are unsettling to people. Deep ones are very common in Lovecraftian fiction and adventure, so that kind of info is really helpful to the handler to make them remain relevant and creepy. Then we have some interesting info about the unnatural and how it's perceived in the Korean and Vietnam conflicts and in China, which is cool. Got timelines. We're up to World War II now. Again, we're carrying on with key pieces of information and disinformation. Pisces, by the way, being the UK equivalent Delta Green, and GRU SV8 is the Russian equivalent. So then we have the Office of Strategic Services, the Crucible campaign. So Delta Green at this time was a secret department within the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. So Delta Green has evolved a lot over its history, and that's an important part of why secrecy and the current state of the program is the way it is. So I think as a handler, understanding this history is both really useful in case you need to educate characters about why they're doing what they're doing and what things have gone wrong in the past, but also to give you that real sense of the world building that's been done behind the scenes here in the past Delta Green supplements and in this new edition, to really give you a true sense of why things have evolved the way they have. And that can help you give your agents a sense of purpose and a sense of there being a reason behind what they're doing. Then we have some info about Majestic as well, as we know from the Fall of Delta Green. So Majestic is a misguided group that is trying to harness the unnatural for the benefit of the United States. Of course, that is all a bad idea. It's not good. And the Greys, as we know, are a kind of deep cover for the Migo. So again, while they do exist in a sense, Majestic doesn't really know what they're dealing with. And so given that they're very well funded and have much more extensive bureaucracy and organization than Delta Green currently, Majestic remains an internal threat that needs to be kept into account. And then we have the Cold War. That has some advice about running a Cold War campaign. It's great. You could also take your Delta Green game to these eras. You have to make some adjustments to weaponry and stuff like that. They give you background on, all the relevant sort of unnatural races and beings and species that popped up at different times. Things that can affect the inner space. The King in Yellow, now it's popped up in research through MK Ultra and Delta Green as well. Then another reorganization in 1961. Period of the fall of Delta Green, what happened then. So it's just loads of useful background information here. And then we had the fall of Delta Green, where they were officially deactivated and green triangles were removed from hundreds of personnel files. But it was not the end. So some of those within Delta Green decided to continue what they were doing without any government backing. And then basically there was no real Delta Green to speak of between 1970 and 1994. It was a sort of unofficial, secret group of agents from other agencies who tried to do stuff for themselves. But yeah, it wasn't really a great idea because you couldn't really have any real sort of field organization in that way. But then again, there was more developments, more reorganizations, and we have the truth behind the grays, good ways to portray the Mi-Go, interesting ways they screw around with time and space and with your memory, which is always disconcerting for the player. Yugoth is, of course, the official home of the Mi-Go, which we call Pluto, but it also identifies, other alien races and where they come from beyond that point as well. So again, throughout this section, they really keep it spiced up with loads of additional background info. And then we have the Delta Green Majestic War between 1994 until March 2001. So this is kind of the subject of the original Delta Green supplements that were back in 1997, I believe, for Call of Cthulhu 6th edition. And now we've gone beyond that to the present day, which is really cool. And basically, well, that's really gross. There's also been some diaspora from Majestic who've left and kind of secreted away some secret documents as well. And now, basically, 21st Century opened with, of course, 9/11, which shocked America as a whole and the whole intelligence services program. And so there was a proliferation of new black budget spending like we've never seen before that affected Majestic and Delta Green in very different ways. Delta Green sort of came back into the fold. So if you're playing Delta Green in the current day, you're playing in an era where Delta Green basically exists again as an official entity, where it didn't for a very long time, and it is referred to as the program. And of course, there are international operations. And the program found itself deployed anywhere in the globe American troops could be found. That included Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as in staging areas such as Germany, Turkey, Pakistan, Italy, and Japan. During the invasion of Afghanistan, no fewer than 32 operations were run by the program to determine if unnatural threats were involved. In Iraq, that number grew to 70. Bear in mind that Delta Green, like the CIA, is certainly not afraid of operating on foreign soil, and they have sort of carte blanche to do what the hell they want, which could be both useful and dangerous. And we have some specifics here about involvement in the Iraq War, more information about Kadath and the Plateau of Lang, and then some more timeline information, the effects of Hurricane Katrina, which is very interesting. Then we have Operation Active Static and the King in Yellow, which comes through in full campaign form in Impossible Landscapes, which is a fantastic campaign, by the way. Carcosa itself, which is the home dimension of the King in Yellow, who's trying to infiltrate our world. Then we have the evolution of GRU SV-8. So that's part of, the collapse of the Soviet Union, switch to the Russian Federation, of course, had effects on how they deal with the unnatural, and thus relationships with Delta Green, etc. So again, just reading through this will give you so many ideas for cool stuff that you could do even without buying the official scenarios, which, by the way, are, generally speaking, fantastic. Then we have the Great Race of Yith covered on a couple of pages here. You've seen probably a pattern by now that there's a kind of a page of their general aims and information, and then a page which says Threat Matrix, and this is about their kind of how they present in-game and how you can represent them in an appropriately horrific way. It's really, really useful, again, for the handler. Yeah, and then we have a sort of schism in the program. We've got some difficulties in current day Delta Green, but at least they're not completely off the grid like they were from 1970 to 1994. That's the main thing. And there are relatively few people who are aware of Delta Green. No whistleblowers so far have gone public. If they did, probably it'd be difficult for people to believe that it's real. So they have that going for them. And yeah, then the rest of this, we've got a lot more context for what the Delta Green agent will have to deal with, both domestically and internationally, including things like mafiosos, what might happen in the future. And then we get to the unnatural. Here we go. They make the key point that nobody from Delta Green, either the Outlaws or the program, understands everything presented here. So this is stuff that you discover bit by bit, piece by confusing piece as you go through Ops. You might find tomes or other sources of unnatural knowledge, as in Call of Cthulhu, and they will have different amounts of time you'll need to spend and a sanity cost to studying them. But you can gain useful knowledge and rituals and so forth. Then we have info about the Great Old Ones, some notes about truth, which is useful. The influence of belief on these entities is quite interesting to think about. Yeah, there's general info on unearthly intelligences, including Mi-Go, Elder Things, and Troggoths. Earthly intelligences like the Ghouls, Deep One, and Serpent Folk, who actually live on the Earth in some fashion. Creepy-ass person there. We have the extra-dimensional intelligences, so the Great Race of Yith, and the Loigor, so they exist kind of outside of our normal concept of space and time. Then we have the other unnatural threats, which are numerous and plentiful. And then we have a period of unhistory, which is really awesome. And it starts at 4.48 billion years ago. So the Hounds of the Angles, or the Hounds of Tindalos, are thrown into the corridors of time. all the way back then. And it comes up all the way to 50 million years from now. So at that point, the great race of Yith returns to incarnate into a hardy coleopteran species and reconquer the Earth. That's what they hope to do anyway. Then we get into unnatural tomes. We've got some various assets here, and they include the obvious things like the Play of the King in Yellow, the Necronomicon, the Narcotic manuscripts, etc., but also some more modern stuff like Joseph Camp's grimoire, the files of Grant Emerson, certain research papers, surveillance videos, and stuff. Unnatural knowledge can come in new forms because we're in a new era. It's not the 1920s anymore. Yes, the Necronomicon is kind of the core text of the unnatural, so you can gain pretty much any ritual from that, but it has a huge sanity cost. Other texts will be more focused oftentimes, so they have recommended rituals like the Book of Dagon. You might learn the Call of Dagon, Storm and Stillness, Whispers of the Dead, brackets Cthulhu, because they're focusing on Dagon and Hydra, basically. Then we have looks at all these different sources of unnatural knowledge, which give you, breakdowns of what you can learn, the sand loss, study time, and what you gain to your natural or occult skills, or sometimes both, and the recommended rituals for each. And there's quite a few. Of course, you can come up with new ones. Very easy to do. Hypergeometry is once again, the game's version of magic. So there are rituals. It's just kind of reflecting that presumably this force and the power of rituals is perhaps some kind of form of mathematics or science that we don't understand yet. So it's referred to as hypergeometry. And they note as well that this is not meant to generate carefully balanced game mechanics. The power of a ritual is balanced by the sanity effects on the player, basically. And if you abuse that power, then, you'll just go insane and become useless very quickly. And they give you the learning and activating ritual time table, which is basically identical to what you saw in Fall of Delta Green, except the sand loss is different because we're dealing with a different scale. And then we have the same sort of ideas about activating rituals, using objects to help you, creating new hypergeometrical effects, and ways to go about doing that. So here's some ritual details. It'll cost you willpower points. There'll be different costs for different scopes, increasing sand loss as the scope increases, sand loss for a failed attempt, so whether you succeed in the ritual or not, you're still going to lose sand. And you also take damage at certain levels, including 99% lethality at cosmic level, but that could affect something in another dimension. A sweeping scale could affect another galaxy. I don't know where you're going to get 45 willpower points from. I guess you need a large group of participants. But yeah, you could also have flawed rituals, which could have increased costs or weird side effects, so be careful of those. And then they give you some ideas of how to use rituals for things like moving things around, summoning things, scrying to the future, and summoning in particular, like in Call of Cthulhu, is a very common thing to do. Basically, you will be able to, if successful, summon and bind a creature, and they will do something for the caster determined by the handler based on their kind of intelligence level. So if you give them an overly complex instruction for their intelligence level, they may do something you don't want. The greater the entity's intelligence, though, and a lot of these entities are much smarter than humans, then they can do quite complex things for you. Once the action is complete, they'll return to their point of origin. However, some of these entities actually want to stay here, so you need to make sure that you got your summoning circles unbroken and all that kind of good stuff. Here's the index of sample rituals. There's quite a few of those. And again, these are things you may have heard of before. So, calling up Dagon, calling forth those from outside. So this is the basic summoning ritual. You can call up zombies, the changeling feast, so you consume a human corpse and later assume the victim's likeness, which is pretty gross. Eternal meditation, basically you can call ghouls. The closing of the breach, so that's trying to break a connection with the unnatural and dispel something. You can expand your consciousness, so you try to ascend into higher dimensions. You could be part of, a higher reality, but your body also disintegrates, so be careful. You can create a stone gate to establish links between times and places. You can use the Do-Na formula, which is a difficult incantation that opens the operator's awarenesses to places and events anywhere on Earth. Costs 30 willpower points from the operator assistance and or human sacrifices and 1d12 sand. Entities or events seen in the vision may cost further sand. So, yeah. Potentially useful, but also potentially very deadly to your brain. Then we've got the Elder Sign, always handy to keep the unnatural at bay. The Elixir of Infinite Space, so it creates a very rare dose that makes you immune to harmful environments and effects of the handler's choosing, so including possibly outer space or deep waters. Exaltation of the Flesh, you can exchange personalities, which is like mind transfer in Call of Cthulhu. Exorcism, there's a table as well for personality exchanges and, the sand loss for the victim and the operator. Then you can find things, you can do a bit of healing bombs, you can send immortal messengers to the unseen world. You can create a drug called Liao and invoke advanced mathematics and ancient occultism. Then your mind will drift to other times and places. So you could look back in time or forwards in time. You can lure the Hungerer, which is a dimensional shambler. You can draw pentagrams of power and imbue the design with power with human or animal sacrifice. So that will confer a plus 20% bonus to control a summoned enemy, or plus 20% with a human sacrifice. Powder of Ibn Ghazi, we know that one. Makes invisible things visible. You can reanimate things, preserve a living brain, even if it's separated from the body. That's something the Migo are obviously very good at. You can do seeing the other side and look through an unnatural gate without actually going through it. That's quite useful. You can speak to birds and beasts, which could be handy when you're investigating and running out of leads. You got the Voorish sign, so you can briefly see things that are normally invisible because they're out of phase with our reality. You can summon a winged steed. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. And then we have our unnatural entities, and so they're listed as kind of our bestiary, but they have a great amount of description, and they give you, these little bits of op-int, so operational intelligence, about how to run combats with some of these entities, and a lot of them have special properties. So the color out of space can have a range of POW values. It's transcendent, so it avoids any kind of normal damage. It drifts and flies about in a sort of random way. It can induce malaise, it can feast on POW, and it causes sanity loss as well. Then we've got different kinds of deep ones. That's a greater deep one, so they're real bad. You can see they've got enormous stats, 26 strength, and they have very damaging attacks, 2d6, and armor piercing with lethality 10. Yeah, not so great. Lesser deep ones, a little bit less terrifying. They don't have any lethality to their attacks, but they do have damaging talons and grapples. We've got dimensional shamblers who can just sort of warp you to another place. They grasp and vanish, and they whisk you out of existence, never to be seen again. So watch out for that one. They can also do focused transcendence. Basically, they can be transcended to attacks from one particular target, which is pretty annoying if you happen to be that person. Elder things who are super intelligent with 5-lobed brains and have been on the earth for a very long time, as we know from the Mountains of Madness. We have the Feaster from the Stars. I think this is a star vampire, essentially. So it paints its innards with blood, making it visible when it's feeding, but normally it's invisible. We have ghouls. There's a ghoul there, I guess, although it looks rather nastier than I would have expected. We have the face of a Yithian, the great race of Yith. This is them in their natural cone-shaped vessel. They have enormous strength and con, enormous int and POW. They're very resilient. They're effectively immortal, so even if you appear to kill them, they persist somewhere else in time because they don't exist in our normal space-time limitations. They have total knowledge from all times and cultures. They're temporally omniscient. They can travel through time with their minds. And of course, they have baffling natural biology. And they can also transfer their minds into a human vessel. That human vessel can then jury-rig together some really dangerous stuff like electric guns, temporal mines, and mind transfer devices. And they also gain benefits from having Great Race of Yeth consciousness in their limited human heads. There we have a gray hiding behind the corner. So these are Migo constructs, as we know from before. They're not particularly strong in themselves, but they do have some rather special tools, including paralysis sphere they can shoot at you. They have telepathy, so they can scan your human thoughts and send messages to you. And Migo can perform rituals through the grays kind of remotely, which is also challenging. Then we have the Hounds of the Angles, our friends the Hounds of Tyndalos. We've got the Hunting Horrors, the flying faceless black bat things, and they can seize you in their grasp and fly you away. They like to retreat from light, but they're at home in nearly any other environment, including open space. We have Ifrits, which are creatures of fire. The insects from Shagai, which are horrific because they can just fly right through your brain since they're out of phase and take control of you with possession. So that's real bad. The Kunyani, a near-human species believed to persist in caverns beneath the earth. Again, the subject of a really good Cult Cthulhu campaign, so look out for those guys over there. But they do appear in Delta Green as well, and there's a nice description of them as a threat matrix in the history chapter as well. And we have the Liveliest Awfulness, and we also have the Loigor, and then we have, who else? Yeah, that's more about the Loigor. So we get tons of background information on the major entities, which is really nice. And of course, they can do lots of terrible things, like activating constructs, causing depression or cancerous growths. They can drain your energy, like your willpower, basically. They can cause EMF effects, like a EMP, mini EMP. And here's a summary of their powers, because there's so many, basically, so don't mess with them. And they also control quasi-dinosaurian constructs, great deadly reptilian shapes in which to ravage the physical world. So not great. They have huge bony talons at 70% with lethality 20% and armor piercing 5. A savage bite at 50% with lethality 30 and armor piercing 10. So yeah, they are very destructive. We have the Metokangmi, which is the abominable snowman, which is another Migo construct. And we have the Migo themselves. So these are kind of fungoid aliens that have long haunted the solar system. They can fly by themselves through space. Yeah, they can do lots of weird stuff. So they can fly in any environment. They can grapple and inject you with a substance that erases your memories. They can change their form as needed, and they can exist in a multitude of dimensions. So a successful lethality roll destroys a Migo, but other attacks are unpredictable. They can also bypass physical obstacles up to 100 meters, so that's just like Call of Cthulhu. And they have some cool tools like the electric wand, the macro-dimensional scalpel, and a gravity weapon that can fling people around. Lethality, 65% attack, but it affects everything in its range, so it's very indiscriminate. They also have a buzzing imitation of human speech. It can hold rudimentary conversations with humans. We've got the Serpent Folk, who've been around for many years as well. Again, subject of some cool campaigns in Achtung Cthulhu, 2D20, and Call of Cthulhu as well. They're typically known for being good at casting rituals and dealing with magic. They are immortal as well. They have venom, and they all know unnatural rituals. Yeah, Changeling Feast, Fascination, Infallible Suggestion, Obscure Memory, and Withering are the most common, but some know many more. So they're very good wizards. We have the famous Shoggoths, so a big protoplasmic mass of horrible goo. Its intelligence is roughly on human scale, but its modes of thought are incomprehensibly alien. It seems to act with mindless wrath, but it may have inscrutable goals, which are served by the destruction it causes. And you can see the destruction. I mean, it's got lethality 15 on a crush attack, 30% lethality on a smash attack, and an impale attack does damage 1d10 plus 2, armor piercing 5. So that can kill you straight away as well. They also have fury, really strong endurance. They can ooze, shift, grow, or change their plastic form to fit through almost any gap. You can't really use stealth against them because they've got a billion eyes everywhere, and they can smash with up to a dozen huge limbs, and an attempt to dodge this attack is at plus 20%. And they are pretty much unstoppable. If you get them to 0 HP somehow, they'll be desiccated, but not dead. It'll reconstitute to half strength in 2d20 hours, but it can only be destroyed if you take that desiccated stuff and burn it or subject it to other destructive forces. Then we got the Formless Slime of Tsathoggua. They can grasp you and absorb you, so that also has lethality 15%, which is pretty rough. And they can ooze around, much like the Shoggoth. And they have strange senses, which give them alertness bonuses within 10 meters away. And they can undulate at up to 80 kilometers per hour. Got the Star Spawn of Cthulhu, which, as always, are terrifying. Their bodies can naturally displace and reform. They can discorporate if you hit them with a successful attack with a lethality rating of 50% or higher, which they explode in disgusting spray of slime and fragments, but it seems they probably reform. They can fly, they can grab and consume. The spawn smashes a limb down, seizes the target, and drops them into an orifice for digestion. If the dodge and strength tests fail, the target suffers a lethality attack of 40%. Nutrients from the shredded target restore 1d12 HP to the spawn. They also have psychic shout, as they do in Call of Cthulhu. They can work any ritual with as much ease as the handler thinks fitting, so don't mess with them. Spawn of Yogg-Sothoth are similarly difficult. They tend to use grasping tentacles, and they always seek hypergeometry and have mastered many rituals, as many as the handler wants. In particular, they like to summon its kin with call forth from the outside and communicating with them by the Donau formula and the Vorus sign and other such things. And again, they have baffling unnatural biology. We've got spectral polyps, which, here we go, they're the flying polyps that we've known from Lovecraftian history. They sense their environment through higher dimensions. They have a spectral infection attack with lethality 40%, and a lashing out attack with lethality 10 and armor piercing 5, so again, not to be messed with. They can also control the wind. They can evacuate huge areas of atmosphere, causing a thunderclap, and the spectral infection, basically, if they simply touch you from their visible portions, it's enough to disrupt living material as if it were a lethality attack of 40%. And you also suffer sand loss, potentially, as the polyp consumes living matter, like a fire converting wood to ash. Then we've got those beyond. So this is the unseen world that lives sort of in tandem with us, but in a different phase of reality. We've got the disc-shaped liquivore, ophidian liquivores, tumbleweed liquivores, the wendigos, the white apes. Again, we've seen these in Fall of Delta Green, but with just a little bit more detail here by the nature of the system. We've got witches familiars, zombies, and then we've got the great old ones themselves. Of course, Azathoth. And of course, you can't really kill them, but there are ways to dismiss them. And yeah, Azathoth will just continue consuming things and growing larger until it's dismissed. So only really crazy people try to call them. But of course, some of them do exist. Got Cthulhu. He has his effects and abilities, including sand loss, and he can kill an enormous amount of people with his attack. His disinterested SWAT, he automatically hits a selected target, has a kill radius of 5 meters, and a 60% lethality rating, and it cannot be dodged. Once a great old one is in play, you're pretty much screwed. That's very much clear. And then we have Gatanathoa, Glaki, Itlashua, also known as Ithaqua, Nodens, Nyarlathotep, who is the most weirdly human-like of the great old ones. He likes to take human forms and mess with people rather than just cause unfathomable destruction. He likes to sow the seeds of chaos as well, so that makes him particularly deadly in certain circumstances. We've got Ku Tugqua, who has various names in different parts of the world, and appears to be linked to the Ifrits. Then we have Shub-Niggurath, also known as the Black Goat with 1,000 Young. And we have Atled Naka, the Great Spider. Slightly different name here. I'm not sure why it's different from Call of Cthulhu. Maybe it's a licensing thing. We've got Sathogwa as well. Igolanak, Yeg, who is the Serpent God. Yog-Sothoth. All of them have an aura of power as well. So the stronger gods like Yog-Sothoth, any human in their presence is minus 40% on all rolls except sanity. If you fail your sand roll for encountering Yog-Sothoth, you can't act for 1d10 plus 2 turns, instead goggling in abject terror. A successful attack with a lethality rating of 70% or higher may cause them to dissolve, but whether it is vulnerable to that or simply transcend it is up to the handler. And it can engulf people, which means they suffer a 50% lethality attack which can't be dodged. You may not be slain, but you just vanish out of space-time, depending on what the handler decides. Then we have some interesting stuff about creating your own unnatural threats, determining their defense and attacks, trying to balance them in gameplay. But it's a horror game, you don't really need to balance things so much. Now we have some details about the schism in the program, so the difference between the program and the outlaws. I won't spoil that for those of you who are going to be agents and not handlers. But yeah, lots of useful background information here, things to be aware of when you're doing your research, and how you're running assets and so forth. Important individuals within the program. So that includes the Director, Special Agent Abraham Mannon, Director of Operations, Admiral Gates, the Director of Intelligence. So there's some useful NPC stat blocks in here. Security Directors, Directors of Research. These can all turn up during downtime, perhaps, or when you're getting your assignments from Delta Green. Lots of interesting ways to use these people. So it's great they're here for the handler's use. And we've got the Outlaws. So these are the people that rejected the compromise of being in the program, basically. But I won't tell you any more than that. We'll kind of skip through that. So there's a lot going on, a lot of challenges to face as a Delta Green agent. And then they go through the steps of recruitment. Basically, if you are exposed, then the agents will look for your response. They'll give you a talk, advise leaving out any references to the unnatural in their reports. They'll look for you again and look for a recurrence of something involving the unnatural, and again look at your response. And if you seem to be suitable for facing these threats and keeping them secret, then they might then recruit you. Then it'll go up to ACEL, who are the main individuals who decide such things. So that's how the Outlaws look for people. We got some key people within that group. And then we have some information about what the program, what the Outlaws actually know, about all the different beings that have been outlined in the Handler's Guide. And then we have the Opera, which is about running operations. So, this is very much kind of straight out of what we saw in the Fall of Delta Green. So nothing new to show you there. Creating the campaign, again, very similar. Creating an operation, creating some NPCs, leads, dead ends, that sort of stuff. And then, of course, the resolution of the problem has to be followed by the cover-up, because this is Delta Green we're talking about. And then finally we have appendices, which includes Operation Fulminate, Sentinels of Twilight. Again, it's quite hardcore, this introductory adventure, so I think it's kind of good in a way. It tells you what you're in for, but yeah, some people may struggle a bit with it. It's short but brutal. And then we have as well some generic useful stuff like generic NPCs, regular animals and stuff like that. And then the appendix. So that is Delta Green. The last thing I want to say, really, because I will do a comparison video, as I said, to kind of help you decide which Lovecraftian horror game is the right one for you, potentially, depending on what you're looking for in your games. And it's not going to be the same for everybody. I think Delta Green is my favorite horror game at this moment, because it is so focused and it's so good at what it does. But, it does do things that not everybody will find attractive. Like, it focuses a lot on the horrors of being out of control. And also, the campaigns don't mess around. Like, for example, Iconoclast here, in the prologue mission of this campaign, you fight as agents of ISIL or ISIS if you prefer. So you're playing as terrorists for a good chunk of the game. That might throw some people off. Or you have Impossible Landscapes, which is a thick masterpiece of a campaign, in my opinion. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful, beautifully written, wonderfully put together, but there are large portions of it where, your agents are pulled in and out of what seems to be reality or might not be reality, and it's confusing, it's hellish. They don't always have agency, these agents, and that can throw people off. So I'm going to talk more about that in the follow-up video, but I think if your players can handle the rigors of a Delta Green campaign, you absolutely should play it. It's a wonderfully constructed game. I haven't nearly done it justice in just this short amount of time, but I'll talk a bit more about Delta Green versus Trail of Cthulhu versus Call of Cthulhu in a further video to help you guys decide. But in the meantime, I hope you have a happy Halloween. I hope this was useful to some of you out there. I will cover other Delta Green supplements in detail in the future. I'll also look at a lot more stuff for Call of Cthulhu because my shelves are full of that stuff. I'll look at the other supplements for Trail of Cthulhu, and then we'll look at some of the pulpier games I've got, like Pulp Cthulhu, Octum Cthulhu 2D20, all that kind of good stuff. So lots more Lovecraft to come, but for those of you who don't care about Lovecraft, I do also have a large World of Darkness collection, which I may save for next Halloween, but I'll throw a few bits and bobs in there so you don't have to wait forever. But I am a fan of the World of Darkness and playing as a monster as well. Not all about Lovecraft, but I am a big fan of Lovecraftian stuff. So yeah, enjoy the holiday. Go out there and scare somebody, but make sure they don't lose any sand on the way and that doesn't blow back on yourself. Keep our operational security if you run into anything unnatural. And in the meantime, if you have a moment and you feel like it, please leave a like and a subscribe. It just helps me out, makes me feel good. I don't make any money from this. It's a very expensive hobby as well, and I don't have a Patreon or anything. But I don't care. I do this because I love these games and I want you to see them. So I'm just happy if people are out there talking about more stuff like Delta Green, Trail of Cthulhu, etc. So with that being said, take care of yourselves, enjoy Halloween, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the comment section and in my next videos. So take care and see you soon. All right, bye-bye.